I just like to hear in.
So here we are again. I guess today is the due date for your papers. Are there any questions about that or what we were saying last time? One thing I can say is that on Wednesday, one of the students did intervene and ask some questions. I keep asking you, do you have any questions? And some student, I don't know who it was, but I really enjoyed that. And I'd encourage you to do that more. Makes the class more interesting. And I'm sure some of you need clarification of various points. So feel free to do that if that's so. Again, is there anything that came up from last time that you want to talk about? Okay, we're talking about the Ottoman Empire now. And I think in talking about that, I think I'll bring up this map. Can people see the map? Hello?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. So everything in brown then is, or shades of brown, is the Ottoman Empire. And of course, in Europe, this is the first part of the 16th century. So you have, of course, Charles V of Spain. You have the King of France, Francis I. You have Henry VIII, and so on. This is the period from which this map dates. And it's the period of the greatest expansion and power of the Ottoman Empire, because there was, and we'll speak about him maybe later in the lecture, the most important of the sultans in the history of this empire was Suleiman the Magnificent. And it was he who basically, through conquest, created what you see before you. This empire, which was greater than any state in Europe, both in population and in geography. And of course, you can see in its northern extremity, well, it extends up into Central Europe, and you're virtually at the gates of Vienna. At its northern frontier. And of course, off to the right is the Black Sea, and to the north, this is the Crimea here, and you can see this is the Crimea, and north of Crimea, this is, of course, disputed territory between the Ukrainians and the Russians at the present moment. There's fighting going on right there. So that's the northern limit. And of course, you see all of the North African coast extending as far away as Algeria as part of this empire. And then Egypt uh, the whole of the Arab Middle East, including Saudi Arabia and the holy place, Mecca, which is the focal point of Islam. All of that is part of this empire. So it was huge. And of course, uh, from the point of view of the Western Europeans, it was frightening because Christian Europe had been at war with the Ottomans, the Arabs, since the 7th century, and suddenly you have this consolidation of this vast Islamic empire. So it was seen as and in Spain, the Christians and the Arabs got along from time to time, but generally they were hostile to one another, and the Europeans were fearful of being overrun. And already in the class, when the Ottomans took over Constantinople in 1453, Portugal set out on its voyages, which were seen as a way of circumventing Ottoman power and so on. Are there any questions about what I've said? The Sultan, of course, was both the head of the religion and the head of state. This was, as I said last time, Sunni Islam we're talking about. Sunni Islam. Just a second. Sunni Islam, as I was saying last time. I'll speak about the Shia in a little while. In any case, I would say that the Sultan claimed absolute power. He had the last word. Of course, he had advisors, but he had the last word when it came to defining the religion and defining really the law. His authority was absolute, way more absolute than the King of Spain or the King of France. Indeed, Machiavelli, who, as you know, wrote The Prince, expressed admiration for the Turkish Sultan because he had such unlimited power. And remember, this is what Machiavelli was all about. Now, that being the case, I would say that, as a matter of fact, the power of the Sultan went so far that although on a day-to-day level, landlords had land and merchants had their property, nevertheless, in theory, the Sultan owned everything. There were no full property rights in Islam. And given that, the complete power of the state, and by the way, the markets were controlled. There were markets and many, many towns in the Ottoman Empire, but the markets were regulated by the state. There was nothing like this idea of supply and demand dictating what price you paid for gasoline. No, it was all regulated. And so given the sort of weakness of property rights, property did exist, but the property rights were weak. Given the power of the Sultan, given the regulation of the markets, capitalism was impossible in the Ottoman Empire. because all of the things I've been talking about contrast with what eventually came to be the case in Europe. Now, I said last time, and I want to just say a little bit more about this, the biggest obstacle to sort of our comprehension, that is to say, people who have been raised in sort of the West European tradition, sort of understanding a society like the Ottoman Empire, is the all-pervasiveness of religion, in this case, Islam. And that's related to the different history of the Ottoman Empire as compared to Western Europe. Because as I was saying last time, at the end of the 18th century, there were revolutions in America and in France, and they separated the church and state. And from that point onwards, you get a kind of secularization of Western society. It's not that religion disappears, far from it, but its political power is gradually more and more reduced in the West, whereas that does not happen in the Middle East. It doesn't happen in the Ottoman Empire. In fact, religiosity in some way is intensified because with the gradual penetration of the Middle East by European imperialism, or the penetration of the political, military, and economic power of places, countries like England and France, the population, the Islamic population in the Middle East becomes more and more defensive, and religion becomes a defense. And indeed, it's more than simply sort of a certain set of practices, sort of the basic kind of premises of Islam, as you probably know, are that, of course, Allah is the God, Muhammad is the prophet of God, and the holy book of Allah is the Quran. It's just like the Christian Bible. So there is Allah, the all-powerful God. There's the Quran. There's Muhammad as the interpreter, the giver of the Quran. There is the idea of praying several days, several times a day in the direction of Mecca. And there is the idea of the pilgrimage. Once in a lifetime, a good Muslim should make a pilgrimage to Mecca. So monotheistic religion, Muhammad writes the Quran, which is the holy book. There is the idea of prayer several times a day, and so on. Are there any questions about what I've said? Okay. In saying, in insisting on the importance of religion in the Middle East, especially in the modern period, I don't want to overdo it, because European influence did gradually penetrate into the Ottoman Empire, and educated Ottomans, people who lived there, gradually began to understand that the West was moving ahead. And over the centuries, especially starting from the 18th century and continuing in the 19th and 20th centuries, there have been many, many attempts at a certain modernization of the education system, has taken place, and people began to read the literature, the science of the West, and so on. But it has been tough going because the influence of the religious authority is basically what I say. And the fact that Islam is a culture, aside from being a creed, it's a way of life, has inhibited the full onset of modernization. Having said that, I want to point out to you that, as a matter of fact, that after 1945, just to sort of round things off, there did develop in the Islamic world what we call radical nationalism. In many states like Egypt and Syria, in Iraq, there developed political movements which took the form of what I would call a radical nationalism. The states that I've mentioned, for the most part, were Arab, although Iran was not Arab. So there was a radical nationalism which was secular. And also there were, and this is also quite significant, in Iran, in Iraq, and in, for example, Sudan, which is located south of Egypt, there were very significant communist movements in these countries. So yes, the importance of religion, but nevertheless, you do have this these modernizing forces. You can't sort of stereotypically sort of characterize the Middle East as hopelessly superstitious and religious. It's simply not true. And as a matter of fact, there was a very famous professor whose career, he was at Columbia University. He was a Palestinian, Edward Said, you see his name here, who wrote a book called Orientalism. It's a very famous book. And in this book, he argued that the Westerners have this completely fantastic idea of the Middle East, of Muslims, of Arab people. And in terms of the conception or the imagination of the West Europeans, they, as he put it, other the Orient. They other, they use the term other. And this term others, in terms of the historical and cultural studies, become very important. The lack, the sort of ethnocentric, and here we come back to the term I used at the beginning of the year, the sort of ethnocentric view, the othering of people who are different from you. This term was invented by Said with reference to the Western perceptions of the Middle East. So are there any questions about what I've said? All of this is by way of introduction. So I want now to say, just before I get into the actual history of the Ottomans, I want to say that we should also remember that, yes, I've shown the Ottoman Empire on our map. But we should remember that the Islamic world was larger than that. I mean, here you see all of the people, the great majority of the people of the Ottoman Empire were, of course, Muslims. But right next door, you see further east is another very strong and powerful state, not as strong as the Ottoman Empire, but strong. In that state, of course, is Persia. And there too, there was an emperor. It was a full developed civilization, Persian Empire, Islamic. However, of course, well, maybe I'll leave that for just a little while. So there was the Persian Empire, which is another Islamic state, and we can't see this on the screen, but India too was governed by a Muslim elite at this time. The Muslims, the Hindu population was subordinated to a Muslim elite known as the Mughals. So look at this situation. At the beginning of the 16th century, you have the Ottoman Empire, you have the Persian Empire, and then in India, you have the Mughal Empire, and they're all Islamic. So the link between political power and religion here is extremely important. And if we take this one last step, we have to realize that the power of Islam extended beyond these three empires, because down the east and west coast of Africa, Muslim merchants from the Middle East had infused part of the population on the Black populations of Africa and of East Africa and West Africa along the coast, had also converted to Islam. And further east, beyond India, there was Indonesia, but also the southern part of the Philippine Islands and Burma. And they too had become converted to Islam. So Islam was extremely extensive in this early modern period. And the thing is that the religion of Islam, which constituted a kind of, we can call it, it's a religious, but it's also a cultural area. This whole cultural area, including the Ottoman Empire, the Persian Empire, and the Mughal Empire in India, were a common cultural area, but also people circulated, especially merchants, right through this area in a quite free way. There was virtually a free trade zone, I would say, that operated throughout this whole area. And the common religion facilitated commerce and cultural exchange right through this whole area. So this is one point that should be stressed. Are there questions about that, what I've just said? Okay. Now, that's one thing I want to say. The second thing is that Islam already had a quite a considerable sort of civilizational impact prior to the 16th century. Of course, Muhammad lived in the 7th century, and in the wake of Muhammad, in the 7th, from the period from the 7th to the 10th centuries, there were two great Arab empires that covered much the same space as the Ottoman Empire and beyond. There were, in the 7th and 8th century, already these great Arab empires. And of course, they had occupied Spain. And during that period, between the 7th and 10th century, this was a period of great cultural achievement. That Islam was not only a great religion, but the rulers actually sponsored a great deal of scholarship, learning, and even science during that period. For example, basically the beginnings of algebra, that's an Arab word, and the beginnings of algebra can be found amongst the Arabs during this period. The numerals that we use, the common numerals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, etc. They all come from the Arabs. Actually, they're Indian, but they come to us through the Arabs. The use of what we call Arab numerals. Eyeglasses were invented by the Arabs, and as a matter of fact, they systematically studied optics. The Arab scholars made a certain headway in the study of the scientific characteristics of glass and light. And they also continuously studied astronomy. And of course, the architecture of the Arabs is famous as well. But perhaps they're most well known from the fact that these Arab scholars were the ones, not saying the Europeans didn't have any part, but during the Middle Ages, when there were no printed books, we can speak about the Dark Ages. There was more literacy in the Arab world, in the Islamic world, than in Christian Europe. And a lot of the old Greek and Roman classics that I referred to when I was discussing the Renaissance, as a matter of fact, became to be known by Arab scholars, and it was they who basically preserved them and passed them on ultimately to the West Europeans. So the preservation of the classics of Greece and Rome, we have largely as a benefit of Islamic civilization. So taking all that together, what I'm basically arguing is that seeing the Islamic world as simply steeped in ignorance and religious belief, fundamentalist religious belief, is a mistake. What really affected the Islamic world was, I'm not saying that religion didn't play its part. No, I can't say that. I think religion did inhibit the fact that the West Europeans secularized themselves, got away from complete domination by religion, was what made possible science and rational thought. There's no question about that. That is to the credit of the West Europeans. It did not happen in the Muslim world. And certainly the all-powerful influence of religion based on the Quran certainly has to be seen as one of the factors. But it's not the whole story. I think that what we have to understand is that certain economic and political changes crippled the Arab world. That is to say, the Arab world, the Islamic world, in the Middle Ages and during the period of Ottoman ascendancy, the 16th and 17th century, this area was, we can say, the center of the world. The commerce between Asia and Europe passed through this region. There were these great states. But from the 17th century onwards, the rise of the North Atlantic, the rise of the Atlantic, the growing power of England, of France, of Holland, and of the Atlantic world came to dominate. And this area fell into economic decadence. It lost increasingly its economic power. It became a backwater from an economic point of view, starting at the beginning of the 17th century. And this decadence had a lot to do with the sort of cultural decadence of this region, I would say. And then, of course, along came European imperialism. And European imperialism was all about the development of Western Europe at the expense of other parts of the world. And one of those parts of the world was the Middle East. And this has continued right down to the present. So all of those factors have to be taken into account. The last thing I would say about all of this is, what can I say? Amongst the backwardnesses of the Middle East is their treatment of women. And here I have no excuses to offer. I mean, we could talk. There are things to say and so on, veiling and so on, but I would say that certainly West Europeans treated their women badly. In a place like Spain, hey, if you were a woman, you had to be extreme. Well, you could be terrified, but it was very bad in the Muslim world. And I'm not going to develop an apologetic about that. Are there any questions? Or maybe you disagree with me? Tell me.
So Professor,
Who is this?
Andre?
Great. Yes, Andre. That's,
Uh,
you talk. Yeah, Andre, you talk. That's
Okay.
wonderful. Good going. Yeah.
So as I understand it, ultimately the religion is what you say held back the Ottoman Empire because of its.
I didn't say it was the only factor. I said the economic decline that I just talked about. You understand
Right,
that?
because Europe was developing and because they were left behind.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
And religion it also prevented them from separating church and state.
Exactly, Andrew. That's it. Separation
Okay.
of church and state. Yes.
Got it.
Okay. Yes, that's it. That's it. This is absolutely critical. Anybody else have questions or want to make a point?
Hi, Professor. This is Hazel. I just have a question. So I remember you saying in the beginning of the 16th century, like the different empires, like the Persian and India was also Islamic, and it helped with the free trade zone. So how come that didn't like help them like develop more? Was it because of the rise of the like European imperialism that stopped them from like getting more?
Yes, but also, I mean, Persia also suffered from the fact that the trade routes, the Europeans, the North Atlantic took over, and Persia was part of this whole area, and so on. So it was affected as well by this decadence that I'm talking about. But this is a very good question, Hazel. This is an excellent question. That's right. Anybody else?
Sorry, so when you mean the North Atlantic took over, do you mean like how Magellan sailed around Africa, or?
No, I mean that gradually, certainly Magellan, of course, and so on, but gradually the Europeans, and I made that point when I was talking about the ocean-going trading vessels, the Europeans began to sort of, with their huge merchant ships, they developed the trade with Asia. They didn't have to go through the Middle East. And also they began to colonize Latin America and the Caribbean and the sugar plantations. And they even began to send colonists to the east coast of the Americas,
Oh,
including the.
so they grew
So they
gradually
gradually.
independent of it.
Yes, that's right. They
Okay.
the North Atlantic economy gradually became independent of what I'm describing, and actually became a world economy. It literally, in a sense, because it was by the way of the oceans that the Northern Europeans were operating. The Dutch, the French, the English, the Scottish. They were the ones who ultimately assumed the initiative. So I say, and it is related to capitalism, if you could sort of make the connection. You see what I mean? Because behind it all is this kind of growing internal economy. You see? I think you do see. So
Yeah.
that was a good exchange, like just what we've done. I think it sums up a lot of the dynamic here. Okay? Okay. So let's now, in the time remaining, let's talk about the development of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottomans actually were an obscure tribe from Central Asia.
Sorry, Professor, is this a specific review question or is this more general?
What I'm giving you now is an overall view of we'll have specific questions. I think the first question that I have on the review question is a question about the founder of the Ottoman Empire, who is a character by the name of Mehmed II. And we'll get to him as part of this narrative that I'm starting to give you. Okay?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. So they start out as way up in Central Asia. There are these Turkish people during the Middle Ages, and during the sort of from about the 11th century onwards, wave after wave of Turkish people begin to invade, particularly this region here. Does anybody know what this region is? What's the name of this place here, right here? This country? What's
Turkey?
Exactly. This is where the Turks ended up. Okay, these Turks invaded this area. This area, its actual name is Anatolia. Anatolia. Now it's the country of Turkey. That's where the Turks came in. But the Turks were everywhere. They came all through this region. In fact, the Arabs, who I spoke about earlier, from the 12th century onwards, were conquered by these Turkish invaders. And from the 14th century, one of the late coming Turkish groups or tribes, known as, we'll call them the Ottomans, they showed up. There were already Turks there. As a matter of fact, they had largely conquered most of what is today Turkey by the 14th century. Now, understand this area, this place, Anatolia, and what we call the Balkans, had, through much of the Middle Ages, actually been part of what we call the East Roman Empire. If you can believe it or not, the Roman Empire actually survived. It fell in the West. The Roman Empire was long gone. It had disappeared in the 5th century AD. But it held on in the East and right through the Middle Ages until about the 12th century, this whole region was controlled by something called the East Roman Empire, which was the capital of it was Constantinople, which had actually been founded by the Emperor Constantine back in the 4th century. So this region was Christian, but it was not Catholic. It was Orthodox. Now, what I said is a mouthful. So anybody have any questions about what I said? The East Roman Empire. Well, the Turks took over this part here by the beginning of the 14th century, these Turks. And there was constant fighting between the East Roman Empire, some people call it the Byzantine Empire, and these Turks during the late Middle Ages. Turks against the East Roman Empire. And these Ottomans came in because they were very good warriors. They began to become more and more prominent in the fighting between the East Roman Empire and the Turks. And as a matter of fact, these Ottomans, not only were they fighting here for control of Anatolia, this region here, but they actually crossed over into the Balkans, and they, by the end of the 14th century, they began to conquer what we call the Balkans. So the Ottomans, the Turks are already establishing themselves. The Ottomans are active in Anatolia, but at the end of the 14th century, they invade the Balkans. And by the beginning of the next century, by the beginning of the 15th century, the Ottoman Turks have now become the dominant tribe over Anatolia, and now they dominate the Balkans as well. The Ottoman and the East Roman Empire is reduced to simply the city of Constantinople. In other words, by the beginning of the 15th century, the Ottoman tribe now controls the Balkans, and most of Anatolia is controlled by these Ottomans. And this process ultimately reaches its climax in the reign of Mehmed II. And here we come to the review question, which I'll deal with, of course. But Mehmed II is considered to be the founder of the Ottoman Empire. This guy, Mehmed II, because what he does, up until this point, you have
Professor,
basically, yes,
in the questions, you have it labeled as Mehmed the First. Is that a typo?
that's a typo.
Okay, got it.
In the, he does basically 4 things, this Mehmed, 4 great achievements to consolidate this empire. In the first place, he, instead of having this sort of loose tribal control over the Balkans and the Anatolia, he creates a bureaucracy which begins to centralize the government. You get it? He consolidates the state into using a centralized bureaucracy. He can now strengthen his power as Sultan. So creation of a centralized bureaucracy is essential to a state. That's number one. The second great achievement of Mehmed II is that he conquers Constantinople. Now, this city had been founded by Constantine way back at the beginning of the 4th century AD and had withstood innumerable sieges by you name it, Arabs, Slavs, all kinds of people tried to conquer Constantinople, but without success. And Mehmed II, admittedly using with the help of Italian engineers who knew how to deploy cannon, but using a huge fleet, using a huge army and the Western cannon, in 1453, he conquered Constantinople, which sent shockwaves into Western Europe. The Portuguese begin to sail. The whole thing is set into train. But for the Mehmed and the Ottoman Turks, they now have Mehmed II is a sultan. He creates a bureaucracy, and now he's conquered the last outpost of the Christians in the Middle East. So that's the second great achievement of Mehmed. And the third thing is that he instead of destroying the city, the tradition in the Islamic world was if you took a city that was resisting you, you destroyed that city. Mehmed II decides, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to found a new Islamic Roman Empire. And that the city, the capital of that city, is going to have a new name. No longer Constantinople, no longer Rome. The name is Istanbul. Istanbul. And he begins to rebuild and to repopulate the city of Istanbul, once Constantinople. And in the wake of this, he then begins to sort of organize all of the peoples of this emerging Ottoman Empire. And we'll see how he and his successors did this in the next class. Have a great weekend, and don't get trapped in any war while you're at it.